I thank that speaker for his speech, and to continue the debate, I call on the second speaker in opposition to give his speech.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, the first thing I want to do is deal with some of the more fallacious reasoning that we got from the first proposition team today. And I want to look at a couple things. The first thing I want to look at is like the nature of anorexia and how they're going to look elsewhere, and what looking elsewhere actually does, and why those four are actually particularly worse than those we see under the opposition model. And second, I want to look at the nature of anorexia and the nature of communication upon it. They sort of poo-poo this idea of, well, everyone who's anorexic sort of goes to the cognitive behavioral therapist and spills the beans, and we just think it's a wee bit fallacious. And then thirdly, I want to look at things about the meaning. Okay, so firstly, just a few bits of rebuttal. Well, they told us that because, like, it's 30 years ago, no one was anorexic, which is sort of a premise that we contend with. This obviously shows that the internet was somehow the catalyst behind anorexia. And we say, no, might open the fall of communism by that sort of logic. That thing was actually quite nice about my first stage, where we actually talked about looking elsewhere in social. And they told us on their side of the house, well, okay, maybe if you're not an anorexic, but maybe if you're on the cusp, these sorts of websites are what's going to draw you in. We actually say that these websites themselves actually can do quite a good deal of good in repulsing individuals who may be on the cusp and showing them the fruits of their actions because of the sorts of pictures they show and because of the sort of dialogue that actually goes back and forth. And we say that's inherently useful. But what we also say here, Mr. Speaker, and this is actually quite a key point, is that the very means of committing anorexia and of inducing the sorts of things like vomiting and self-starvation can be done so easily by other means. There isn't any utility here. The reason anorexics go to these websites is because they crave the social interaction. When they just want a diet fix, they pick up the Weight Watchers handbook. When they want to know how to induce vomiting, they type induce vomiting into the Google search, because there are legitimate reasons why you need to do that, like say if you swallow poison. And so we don't actually see any social benefit to the things they said under this, like the means of actually doing so. So we think that's just absolutely absurd. The only difference, the only distinction that we make between an anorexia website and these other sites which also have the means of doing so, is these also provide the social continuity that Connie told you in her speech, which is what these people crave and what these people lack. And to divorce them from that is disgusting.
It's exactly what they crave, and that's the problem. They go to a social space where they can try and find other people they can compete with. That's what the problem is.
Right. Okay. Here's the thing. We have a couple of responses to that. We say, first of all, they don't necessarily compete just against other people who they can talk with. They compete against things, they compete against, pictures they cut out of the magazines. We also say to that point, Mr. Speaker, that when they tell you about, well, we're going to set up new websites where they can talk with a cognitive behavioral therapist, we say you actually have some sort of attraction and inducement. When these people feel that they're very secret, the one thing that is special to them is being dragged out into open fora. We say you can only get them to actually communicate their illness is when you give them the specter of anonymity by which they can broadcast their woes. We also say with this competition, with these sort of flags up fora, we say that sort of bidding war is not what most people sign up for when they go into anorexia. And as a result, we say that will actually enhances the repulsive value that I talked about earlier. So finally onto this, secondly onto this issue of what makes anorexia and why is it so special in terms of communication. Well, I've already dealt with that partially, but we say that one of the things that anorexia is, they told you it was a social disease. We say, okay, well the social fora that actually instigate it aren't usually found on the internet. But secondly, we tell you that while it has a social aspect, it's also a very individualistic disease, in that it's something that you feel special about yourself, something that you can keep hidden away from the rest of the community around you, and your family and friends. And thereby to get these people on board, and to harness all of the benefits that first proposition said were good, in finding out information about these people, we first have to offer them the sort of bait that comes when you actually have these sorts of websites and things like that. Because when we say that we're taking it away from them, and thrusting them before the psychologist and demanding them to speak, and I'll take you on this in a second, we say first of all, when they talk to the cognitive behavioral therapist, they tend to sort of lie and evade questions and things like that, when they're finally forced before them. We say, here's one of the few places where they're actually open, and where cognitive behavioral therapy can actually work, and where they can actually take this research material. No, we don't say they can't do behavioral studies and things like that, but we think getting the patient to talk is one of the most important parts of any psychological process, and this is actually the only means of stimulating it.
Don't all these arguments about finding out about the psychological makeup of anorexics on these fora also apply to allowing child pornography forums so you can find out about the psychological makeup?
No. What we say on this side of the house is, the problem with child pornography websites is that it's about access. We say your access to be able to means of starving yourself, i.e. not eating, is inherently within you. We say when it has a link, clicks a picture of the dodgy little girl who's 12 from some country where they legalize it, we say that's a wee bit different from, saying, okay, isn't anorexia safe? And also, secondly, You're actually allowed to make an intellectual argument in most Western countries that child pornography should be legal and things like that. You're just not allowed to actually show the pictures and things like that. That's sort of the free speech point that Connie and I have been trying to forward all throughout this bench. Okay, so finally onto this idea of the limits of speech and things like that. What we basically told you on this side of the house is that we actually have rather strict limits on like when we actually regulate freedom of speech and things like that. And we're going to reply to the first proposition who said, well, okay, it may not be necessarily the worst thing in the world to it may not be illegal to be an anorexic, but isn't it really a bad thing? And we say that actually, by shifting this burden of freedom of speech, they've actually done something rather interesting. They've actually changed the burden of limiting free speech from one of, well, is it illegal, to is it a bad thing? And we don't think that's actually really a good shift that they've made. Because what they've actually done is told you that perpetrating an action itself is actually perfectly fine and okay. They've told you that the means to do so, and encouraging other people to do so, is a bad idea. And we think that's not a distinction that we necessarily uphold. As for their suicide websites, we say that's specific to a couple countries. We don't even necessarily support that sort of limitation on speech. But partially because we say there isn't actually any benefit, because we don't see any new constituencies being mobilized by this effort. So what have I told you today on side opposition? Well, first of all, what Connie told you in her speech is about the social benefits that these bring, which they sort of poo-pooed and tried to tell you that like New England Journal of Medicine could do the same as, these anorexics actually pouring their hearts out online. We told you how they can always acquire the means to starve themselves, or to destroy themselves by other means, how this doesn't actually induce anyone to go there. We also think the sort of competition and bidding war will always exist in other fora. It's only when they can see the repulsiveness and where the endpoint actually leads. When these anorexics actually talk about where their relatives who died. And when, as Connie told you, when reformed anorexics actually come and make their own posts on the forums and things like that, there's actually even a potential for reform. But we also told you the nature of anorexia is that it is very secretive. Now, whilst it's brought on socially through means which they cannot prohibit, means that are perfectly legal, such as dieting journals. The social interaction that they actually create, and that can actually bring them out of it, is by seeing others who have suffered the same sort of way. It's the only way in many cases in which we're actually able to get these people to talk. But finally, we told you about the nature of freedom of speech, and we don't think it's a really good idea to actually set a burden of freedom of speech. You can't encourage people to do things that are bad ideas. Because we say, that's why you have law and things like that, and the rule of law in regulating speech. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. We thank you for those.